Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday evening webinar and the last one hosted by CVETCON for this year. This would be our 30th webinar for the year, so we are very proud and very blessed. And I am thankful for Virbac for giving us this opportunity. So on stage with me, I've got Adele Rothman from Virbac and Professor Stephanie Hansen. You guys know the drill by now. Let me know where you are from, how you are doing, if you are surviving in this heat wave. Are you almost on leave, going on a leave? How's it going? How's life treating you? So let's get started. So I am going to invite Adele to stage. She just wants to say a couple of words. Over to you, Adele.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Welcome everyone and good evening, and thank you so much for joining us again for another Virbac CPD webinar. And thank you for CVETCON for hosting this, and we hope to bring you many more CPD events focusing on the advancements of research with Multimin specifically. And it's really been a privilege for me to be part of this journey of this revolutionary product for the last 5 years, and this product has been going for more than 30 years. And really offering the livestock industry with an evidence-based solution to maximize performance in livestock, with trials going on all over the world all the time on a yearly basis. So yeah, it's really a passion for me. Multimin has over 50 peer-reviewed published trials all over the world. And I'm always excited to share the latest research with our vets and nutritionists and producers alike. But before I introduce you to our speaker for tonight, I just want to share a short video on Multimin with some of you, for those who haven't seen it yet. It's just a short commemorative video summarizing the last 30 plus years of Multimin in South Africa. Thanks, Corne, if you can show that video.
Change is growth, and in every industry we have those who drive change, take risks, and leave their comfort zones. These are the people who keep South African agriculture competitive internationally. We call them the front runners, the pioneers, the reformers, the inventors, the avant-garde. With courage and determination, that's how Multimin was introduced to the market 30 years ago. And what a journey it has been. We salute the developers of Multimin for creating an award-winning, proudly South African, innovative product. We salute you, the early adopters of Multimin, the producers who were willing to challenge the status quo, the farmers who prioritize fertility and production, who ensure food security. We salute the producers who, to this day, still use Multimin as a precision tool to improve the production efficiency of their animals. After 3 decades, Multimin has been able to prove itself as a top quality product backed by scientific data and reliable research. Multimin is proud to have been part of our producer success for the past 30 years. We are proud to be on this journey with you. You have made us a market leader in injectable trace minerals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then with no further ado, let me introduce you to tonight's speaker, yet another expert on our side, Professor Stephanie Hansen, who has done a lot of work with Multimin. She's a professor at the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State University. She obtained her master's and PhD degree from North Carolina State University. And she boasts over 100 peer-reviewed publications, and she secured over $11 million in funding for research in beef cattle. And with a major focus on refinement of mineral requirements for feedlot cattle, she's got a passion to teach the next generation of animal scientists in ruminant nutrition and micronutrient metabolism. And she also co-hosts podcasts on graduate mentoring and a beef podcast show. Thanks, Stephanie.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to get my screen shared here.
Just for everybody that's currently in the heat wave, Stephanie just let us know she's from Iowa and it's minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit where she is. So I don't know if we should feel sorry for her or sorry for our heat wave, but good luck, Stephanie. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see everything okay?
It's all perfect. You can go.
Excellent, excellent. So that is with the wind chill, because we had a huge windstorm come through last night. And actually, I'll tell a quick story here as I get started. One of the things I've been really interested in is transit stress. So just like in South Africa, in the US, our cattle, the cows are where the forage is, the feedlots are often where the grain is, and those are not necessarily in the same parts of the country. So cattle are on a truck for a long distance. And we were doing a trucking study, but thank goodness the calves got off the truck yesterday morning instead of being on the truck overnight, because I would have been very concerned. We had very high wind gusts. So, okay. I'm going to have a LinkedIn QR code at the end of my presentation, so you can follow me on LinkedIn if you're interested. But if you do happen to follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see that I post images like this one quite a bit. I really have enjoyed getting into some of the generative AI things. And when I had a conversation with one of the generative AI bots, I said, hey, I'm pretty sure trace minerals are the superhero of the beef cattle ration. And this is the image it gave me. And I thought, well, heck, that's going in every presentation I give for the rest of my career. Okay, so what are we here to talk about today? We're going to talk about some of our latest research with Multimin, specifically looking at the right time to use it relative to induction in the feedlot when we have some of those newly received stress animals. Okay, so I always like to start with this kind of slide, and that the real question is, why am I a mineral nerd? Why is this the career path that I've chosen? Why am I so passionate about this? And sometimes I say it's because I have a really short attention span. And that's okay in minerals, because it means that I can just find something else interesting. So if you look on the right side of this slide here, these are all things that minerals like zinc and manganese and everything else help support. So I can work with collaborators at the vet school who do immune function work and work on cattle health. I can work with collaborators in meat science and look at how minerals help improve the beef quality and tenderness of the product we make for our consumer, and feed efficiency and everything in between. And these are just feedlot specific examples, but I love minerals, and this is the mineral wheel on the left side of your screen. And you can see all these interactions between minerals. So some of these are antagonistic relationships, some of them are positive relationships, But at the end of the day, they really mean that studying minerals is a very complex subject. And I think that's one of the reasons I really love it. Okay, so we're going to tell 3 stories here today. The first is I actually wanted to start with our very first publication on Multimin. We're not going to go through this really in detail, but just to give you a little bit of setup, and all of the publications I'm going to show today are published, and you should be able to get access to those. So this was our first study where we wanted to really see where was Multimin going when we injected it into calves. And so you'll see we did quite a few samples in both blood and liver. Okay, so we had 20 steers for this project. We actually had Angus steers and Simmental steers because we were originally looking to see if we had any breed interactions, and we basically don't see any breed interactions. They respond really similarly. So this is just looking at those 20 beef steers together. And half of them either got a saline injection or half of them got a Multimin 90 injection. This would have been a growing type ration, so forage based, corn silage based. And then per the label instructions, we would have added what the NRC recommends for the rest of the trace minerals. So we added 10 parts per million of copper, 20 of manganese, 30 of zinc, 0.1 of selenium. So this was quite an intensive study, and really what we were looking for is to say, relative to when we gave that injection of Multimin, shown here at the black arrow on time 0, we then took blood samples at 8 hours, 10 hours, 24 hours post-injection, 8 days post-injection, and 15 days post-injection, so about 2 weeks post-injection. So the red is blood samples, and then we also had liver biopsies a few days before injection for our baseline, biopsies at 24 hours, 8 days, and 15 days. So we're really trying to say, when we inject this blue stuff into the animal, where does it go in the blood? Where does it go in the liver? And I'm just going to show you a few of our pieces of data from here, because this is all published, and I'm going to show you each of the different minerals kind of throughout the different projects I'm going to talk about today. So this is what we see with liver copper. So this again would be our animals having kind of right here at adequate status at day 0. So no real deficiencies in these animals. They had adequate status. They came from our teaching farm. The blue line is the controls. So you can see that the blue lines with the controls really just kind of stay steady. They increase a little bit, but not a lot. And the Multimin cattle pop up about 50 parts per million right off the bat, right? So this is our 1-day post-injection sample, and they're kind of steady with that. This is very consistent with what we typically see with Multimin, as we see about a 50 part per million increase in liver copper very consistently, to the point where when I don't see that, I start to dig in a little bit deeper and find out what else we have going on. And that actually led to some of our other studies we're going to talk about today. So this would be a really, kind of consistent response that we tend to see with Multimin. So this is looking at plasma zinc. So if you're familiar with zinc, one of my favorite trace minerals, I love zinc. It does so many cool things. It supports immune function. It supports protein synthesis. It's hugely important for growth, very important for reproduction. Unfortunately, it is such a nightmare to study from the context of we don't have a good biomarker for zinc. So plasma zinc is what we were measuring in this study just to see where it's going. But just to tell you, it's very difficult to change plasma zinc. So this blue line is control, and it's pretty flat across the 15 days. And that's exactly what we would expect. And what we do see here is that we do see this nice increase at 8 hours and 10 hours for plasma zinc if the animals got Multimin. And then it's back down to baseline by 24 hours. So if you were to go out and take a blood sample 24 hours after injecting Multimin, and then you call Virbac and you're like, yo, why do I not have more plasma zinc in this animal? I just injected zinc. That's totally normal. This is what we call homeostasis. And this is the body trying to take this plasma, it's increased, and now it says we're going to go take it to someplace else like the liver and store it there. And so actually that's what we see here. So now we're looking at liver zinc concentrations in these same studies. So by 24 hours, we've popped up on liver zinc, and then we're kind of back down to baseline here. Cattle don't really have an appreciable place to store zinc. So unlike things like copper and selenium, which it's a gold standard to look at liver concentrations in cattle, liver zinc just doesn't change very much. In fact, it mostly changes when animals maybe get sick or have an off-feed event, but it doesn't change very much because there's just not a way to go grab that zinc and pull it out quickly for the animal. But this is showing that we're increasing there. I always describe liver zinc as like the Amazon warehouse. So zinc comes into the liver and it gets distributed to the 3,000 enzymes that use it. So it's really hard to find a biomarker because none of those enzymes change enough to really pick them up with good detection. Just wanted to show this example from plasma manganese. Again, plasma manganese is very low. This is parts per billion. You may also see results in parts per million, but you would have a lot of zeros in front of it. So this is parts per billion. It's basically right at the detection limit of a lot of analytical instruments for our control. Multimin increases, and again, by 24 hours, still a little bit above in the multimin, but coming back to baseline, and then it's back down to baseline. Similar to zinc, manganese doesn't have great biomarkers. I don't have the data in here, but we do have some studies actually from a transit stress study that we did in 2011, where when we gave multimin to cattle after a 16-hour trucking event, we actually see their manganese superoxide dismutase enzyme activity increase. And that's exactly what we want to see. We don't want these minerals just hanging out in the blood or hanging out in the liver. We want them to be incorporated into all the minerals that support health and growth and feed efficiency, like I showed on that first slide. So this is an example of those enzymes. So this is a selenium-dependent enzyme from the study. This would be red blood cells, and we isolated red blood cells and then analyzed glutathione peroxidase activity. So this is a selenium-dependent enzyme. It has quite a few selenium molecules in it to give it catalytic activity. And you can actually see there was kind of a stress drop here because we have a bunch of sampling that happens here, right, in the first 24 hours. Our controls are actually decreasing glutathione peroxidase a little bit in the blue line, and then they sort of stabilize. And the red lines are multimin. Now, one of the things with enzymes is that especially the human literature would suggest it takes about 14 to 21 days for new mineral to be incorporated into enzymes. And that's really what we're seeing here is that this, they kind of steadily increase and are picking up more by day 15. And that's very classic for how a mineral gets incorporated into an enzyme. And this would be an important enzyme in antioxidant activity or protection. Okay, so I just wanted to use that to kind of set up, like, what do we know about where the product goes? We know it's going to be cleared within about 24 hours from the plasma. Selenium's an exception. It'll stay a little bit longer in the plasma there. And most of them will then end up in the liver where it can then be potentially used by the animal. Okay, so I've presented a lot of multimin data over the years, especially at vet meetings. And one of the questions we always get is, well, nutritional immunity happens in the animal, and in nutritional immunity, the body is trying to pull things like iron and zinc away from invading pathogens so that they can't use it for their own purposes of replication. And the answer is yes, that's true. Now, nutritional immunity is a really important part of host defense. So the natural question was, am I doing a good thing or a bad thing by giving an injection of these trace minerals around a time where an animal might get sick? So we decided to design a study to answer that question. And I want to acknowledge the work of Sue Hong here, who did this for her PhD work here at Iowa State. Emma Reintz, who is a PhD student with me, a really sharp PhD student. Carlos Franco was a master's student in Dr. McGill's lab. And this is my collaborator, Dr. Jody McGill. She's a bovine immunology expert at our Center for Veterinary Medicine here at Iowa State. And she and I have done quite a bit of collaborative studies now. So what we wanted to ask in this study was really about timing relative to feedlot induction, as you guys would call it. So just a brief reminder, of course, multimin, we would use multimin 90 here for our product. That's what we have available. Has selenium, zinc, copper, and manganese in it. And some nice work from John Arthington's lab at the University of Florida and others have shown that giving multimin concurrent with vaccination improves basically titer response. And also can see some subsequent response in a positive way to a bovine virus diarrhea challenge. So we kind of took those in mind and we said, well, our biggest challenge in the feedlot is bovine respiratory disease. And this really should have the word complex at the end after it, right? And believe me, I'm not a vet and I do not play one on TV. I do my best to try to explain this. But bovine respiratory disease complex is one of our biggest health challenges in the feedlot industry. And this is really, I actually heard somebody call it once a management disease. And that is so true, right? Because when animals break with BRD, it is often after a trucking event. We might call that shipping fever. It's after a stressful event like weaning or commingling, heat stress events, other things like that. So we have that initial stressor. And then a secondary bacterial infection is able to set up shop in the lungs. And so in this case, oftentimes that is Mannheimia hemolytica. So this is commonly found in cattle in the upper respiratory tract, but we don't want it to get making home in the lower respiratory tract, and then we can get pneumonia from that. So that's this bovine respiratory disease complex. And we know that in infection across species, mammalian species, when an animal is infected, plasma concentrations of iron and zinc will both drop. Now, I think we are increasingly learning that, especially for zinc, that is not just a way for the body to mobilize zinc away from invading pathogens. It is also apparently really important for signaling for things like T cell development that is using zinc as a cell signaling molecule. Some really nice work from places like Eric Starr's work at Vanderbilt and others that have been digging into that. Okay, so why do we care about trace minerals in here? And really, so here we're looking at the lungs, epithelial cell, right? So breathing in what these animals are exposed to. Just want to set this up for a few of the cell types that our collaborators looked at in this study that we're going to talk about. So we used flow cytometry on blood samples and on lung fluid samples in some different places to look at these specific cell types. So these are gamma delta T cells. These are natural killer cells. These are neutrophils. I always think of some of the original work with neutrophil function saying copper status is so important for copper superoxide dismutase activity, so that when those neutrophils do that oxidative burst to kill whatever pathogen they have engulfed in phagocytosis, that they are going to depend on superoxide to protect themselves, so self-protection, right? So copper and selenium are both really important in neutrophil function. Okay, so this study is really going to dig in on what happens if we give a Mannheimia hemolytica infection specifically to these calves, and then we're going to talk about changing their trace mineral status in a couple of different strategies. Okay, so the hypothesis here was that if we gave injectable trace mineral before or concurrent with disease treatment, we would see better outcomes to a Mannheimia infection than if those animals did not get additional trace minerals. Okay, so Sue made this really nice diagram, so we'll take a minute to walk it through here. Okay, so first of all, top to bottom, the black line is our controls. These are going to be steers that got just an injection of saline. The ITM pre is going to be steers that are going to get multimin essentially at time of induction or time of arrival to the feedlot. I'll tell you in a second how we mimicked that. And then post is going to be animals that get a multimin injection concurrent with Draxin as a part of the antibiotic therapy a couple of days after the infection. Okay, so 10 days before we infect these animals, so 10 days pre-infection, that's what this is here, we have initial liver biopsies. So we'll look at the data a little bit later, but spoiler alert, everybody has adequate status. Nobody's crazy high, nobody's crazy low. These are animals who have no apparent deficiencies, so keep that in mind. Okay, so we let them rest for a few days, and then we put them on a truck, and we truck them all of like 3 kilometers to our other facility. But you'll notice it says 6 hours of trucking. We were trying to mimic this transport stress and kind of the things like that that happen. You're going to a new facility, a new feed facility, etc. With this experiment. So we put those calves on a truck from our beef nutrition farm. We drove them around the state of Iowa for 6 hours, and then to receive them to another farm basically on the south side of town. And so at that farm, that's where they go through the disease challenge. So at the disease challenge, okay, so they arrive after their 6-hour truck ride, so they arrive in the afternoon. We let them rest overnight, and then the next morning, we bring them in and mimic processing. And we did not vaccinate them because, of course, we're about to give them a disease challenge here, but our purpose here was just to do the stress of handling and stuff. So this is our induction time or arrival. And so the pre-treatment, the ITM pre-treatment is going to get multimin at this time. Okay, so most calves will start to break with bovine respiratory disease within about 7 to 14 days after arrival. So what we did was after arrival and giving them that multimin injection, 6 days later, so that's this gap right here, 6 days later, we bring them in, all of the calves, and everybody gets an intratracheal inoculation with Mannheimia. So those colony-forming units are shown up here. So this is our day of infection. We've got Angus steers in here. We did this in 2 groups, basically to accommodate logistics, because we got a lot of intensive sampling. So we had 18 steers in the first group assigned to cross treatments, 14 steers in the second group assigned to cross treatments, and you can see they were about 280 kilos at this time. So very similar to an induction weight would be. Okay, so we're infecting here, and then everybody, of course, starts to get sick because we've stressed them out with trucking, and now we've given them Mannheimia straight into their trachea. So they're starting to get sick. Now, I will point out to you, a lot of Jody's earlier work has been with young dairy calves, and these are with straight beef cattle, right? So what we would call now maybe native beef cattle. And beef cattle are just better than dairy cattle, no offense. So like they have a stronger immune system. So what would just flatten a young dairy calf? The beef calves definitely have a more lackadaisical approach. They're not quite as concerned about it. But I'll show you clinical signs. We do get clinical signs in this period here. So we're starting to get sick, and then 2 days post-infection, we bring everybody in. Everybody gets Draxxin as a part of the protocol here. And at this point, the animals who were assigned to our Multimin post-treatment, they also get Multimin. So they get Draxxin and they get Multimin. So everybody gets Draxxin here. So at this point, we've either had Multimin on arrival or Multimin concurrent with Draxxin or no Multimin at all. We then have additional sampling at day 3, day 5, day 10, and 30 days post-infection. This day 10 is going to be our next, or day 2 and 10 are both liver biopsies. And then some of these other ones are lung lavages, so bronchiolar lavages. So we'll show you what's going on in their lungs. Okay, this was a fiber-based growing diet. So we had rilage, corn, wet corn gluten feed would be the brand, sweet bran here, dried distiller's grains, a little bit of corn, be about 30% NDFs and high crude protein. So it's a diet that feeds out really well for us. We did not supplement trace minerals to this because this is the same diet we had them on for about 4 weeks before this trial, just kind of make sure we didn't have any really high statuses. So our copper is about 5 parts per million, but zinc, manganese, and selenium, even without us adding, are all at NRC and above. Okay, so let's jump right into the results here. So let me start by setting up the graph for you. Okay, so these all look similar. The black with the circle is going to be our saline-only control calves. The red square is going to be those that got Multimin basically at induction. So pre here means before sickness. And the blue triangles here are going to be those that got Multimin concurrent with Draxxin 2 days post-infection. Okay, so let's start with panel A. This is their sum of daily clinical scores. So this is things like, are they coughing? Do they have nasal discharge? You know, how lethargic do they look? These are the things that we would have somebody who didn't know what the treatments were basically walk the barn and look at the calves at the same time every day and give every one of them a score. So then these scores are put together. Now, some of these scores would be more like in the 3s and 4s on some of our like young dairy calf trials. So again, we are having illness and we can see rectal temperature starting to increase here post-infection in panel B, but we don't have a huge disease challenge here. However, we do have some interesting treatment effects in spite of that. So actually the controls shown here in the black with the circles, the higher this clinical score is, the sicker the animal appears. And so you can actually see that our control animals appear quite a bit, or a little bit sicker than either our ones who get Multimin before, so pre would have gotten it out here, and the ones who are post are going to get it right here, right? And so you can see these guys continue to increase, while the ones who had Multimin at either earlier or concurrent are kind of a little bit flatter. And I'll show you some of the different cell changes that we think is contributing to that in a second. Okay, so one of the things that we always do is basically say, if we look at this bronchiolar lavage, this fluid that we collect from the lungs, and we do nasal swabs, basically how much of the hemolytic Mannheimia is there, and basically no statistical differences in either of these panels. So there's, you know, quite a few, there's a lot of Mannheimia that we're detecting, especially in the controls actually here, but statistically no differences. And then similarly, just a lot of variation here, no differences, but you know, 80+% of the samples have hemolytica in them off the bat. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how some of the trace minerals were modified, but I want to remind you that the timing of when we did biopsies for this project was designed to fit around the health questions that we were asking, and not designed to really necessarily see when you would get a peak response or hit the right timing for Multimin. So that's a big part of the reason why I showed you that first study, and you can see kind of the characteristic response that we would expect to see for this. But I think there's some cool health stuff that's actually shown in these graphs as well. Okay, so this would be copper shown on the left. This bar at day 0 is going to be the time of infection. We've got biopsies 10 days before infection. Of course, we would have trucked them in here, 2 days post-infection, and 10 days post-infection. So the first one is, okay, so the little variation here on day 0, these animals we didn't have the results back until after we randomly assigned them treatments. So we just have a little bit of differences here, but it's not statistical. It's interesting to me that after we would have had our trucking event right here, we see these animals in both of these treatments drop. Now, we don't have a biopsy in this gap here. So the animals who got Multimin, they got Multimin right here. If they were a pre-treatment, like this is the arrival to the new feedlot, they might have been dropping too, but because they got Multimin, they were able to, kind of prevent that decrease, which I think is really intriguing, especially if you're going to be trucking animals who have borderline status. Our animals have pretty good status here, and we still see this pretty significant decline that happens. And the only thing that really happened to them is we trucked them to a new feedlot. So I have to, at that point, at least attribute a little bit of that. Of course, here we're also starting to get post-infection within these first 2 days. Okay, so if we gave them Multimin before, we have about a 50 part per million increase. They kind of maintain that. If we gave them Multimin here on this day for the post-treatment, you can see that their increase isn't as much, right? They don't pop up to here. And I think this is because they're trying to overcome some of the disease challenge happening at the same time. I can't say this for sure because I don't have a treatment where I didn't give Draxin, but I have another study that I have tracked some of the effects of Draxin. And I also think Draxin is having some effects on mineral status. So I think that that's something interesting to consider. Okay, when we look at selenium, we see something really similar. If they got Multimin pre, we've increased their liver selenium, and they're able to sort of maintain that in the face of the disease challenge. If they get it post here in the blue, they come up almost as high, but kind of like the copper, they don't get quite as high as those who got it before. And then our controls are actually the lowest here. And I didn't put zinc and manganese in here. They are all in the paper, and I'll have a QR code so you can see the paper. But it is also interesting to see some of the changes that happen just simply due to disease in some of those minerals. Okay, so let's talk about some of the function, right? So it's really hard in these studies. Do you talk about the change in mineral status, or do you talk about the outcome that you were measuring? Because, one probably affected the other. Okay, so one of the things we did in this study was we took blood samples from these animals, and this would have been before we gave them the Mannheimia infection. So this is day 0 post-infection. Took a blood sample. Blood sample goes back to the lab. We isolate the immune cells from those blood samples, and then do in vitro stimulation analysis of those immune cells. Basically saying, if I challenge you, if I told you, hey, you need to be able to mount an immune response, what would you do? So this is basically saying like a readiness for disease kind of proxy. So in the lab, Jody's group does 2 measures. One is the cytokine IL-6, and one is the cytokine IL-1 beta. So we'll just talk about the IL-6 one first. So mock is just going to be no stimulants added. It's just adding kind of the rest of the media. So there's, you don't expect to see a large response here. Then these other 3, LPS, PAM, and poly, are basically all slightly different stimulants that should cause a robust IL-6 response in these isolated immune cells. These are going to be things like LPS is the easiest one to think about. LPS is like that outer layer of a bacterial cell, for example. And so when the body sees LPS, say from a bacterial infection, it's like, okay, we need to mount an immune response. We need to get rid of this. Bad things are happening. And those cells start to produce cytokines, which are then used for recruitment of things like monocytes and natural killer cells and gamma delta T cells and things like that. Okay, so what you can see is that LPS didn't have much of a response here, but both the PAM and then the poly to a lesser extent had a more robust response in the red bars. And the red bars here are from animals who got Multimin 6 days before we took the samples. So these are the ITM pre in the red. And then of course, at this point, because this is day 0 of infection, right, we don't have a post group yet because, that's not going to come for another 2 days. So the white bars are actually all the calves who are on the control and on the pre-treatment or on the post-treatment, because they're all the same at this point. So the only ones who are having a response is if you got Multimin 6 days before we took this sample. So this would suggest that some of that improvement in mineral status, even though these animals have adequate status, which I think is the most interesting part, actually suggests these cells from these animals should be ready to have a more robust disease response, which is really interesting. IL-1 beta, we see a few kind of numerical things here, but not as robust of a difference. We see this very frequently in our studies where one of these, IL-6 will change or IL-1 beta will change, but they don't always change the same way, or they both don't both change. Okay, so this is looking at cells that were isolated from the bronchiolar lavage. So this is a tube that's put down the nose of the calf. We flush their lungs with saline and then pull that saline back out now with all of the goodies from within the lungs, and take those back to the lab and spin those down and process those to isolate the different cells. And then these actually go through flow cytometry to be able to say who's there. So they use a marker for gamma delta T cells, a marker for natural killer cells, and that's what these different things are. So these are like basically the marker used for the assay to identify these cells. Okay, so again, black control, red Multimin before the event, blue Multimin 2 days after infection. And really, these all have this kind of treatment effect. I am showing the full across the days because I think it's kind of interesting to see the full scope of this. But really, if you look at this day 5 post-infection, you see that there are more gamma delta T cells in this lung fluid that we pull out from these lungs in the animals that got Multimin at this time, 11 days prior to this versus 3 days prior to this. So both of the Multimin treatment cattle have more gamma delta T cells, and these are really important as a part of the recruitment of cells to the lungs to have a better immune response. And the controls have the lowest. And the natural killer cells shown here in the right panel show exactly the same kind of pattern. So what we think this means, if you think back to the fact that our Multimin pre and our Multimin post to a lesser extent both have less clinical scores, less visual signs of disease than our control cattle, we think this is part of the reason why. So as we've improved the mineral status of these animals, either before or in the face of a disease challenge, we seem to be positively affecting their abilities to do things like send out cytokine message, shown on the prior slide, which then is involved in recruitment of these cells to come to the lung and say, I'm ready for battle, right? I'm here. I'm ready to fight whatever invading pathogen, in this case, Mannheimia, so that we can get it cleared out and get it reset. Okay, I'm gonna make one other comment here. So this isn't something that we directly studied in this study, but one of the things that I think is really intriguing specifically about zinc, we've been doing some other studies where we've been looking at giving like an intranasal zinc treatment after illness starts. And one of the things that zinc is really important in is things like matrix metalloproteinase. So that's something that basically chews up things like extracellular matrix. So when I think about seeing lungs in the slaughterhouse for animals who really had limited lung capacity, it's often because they have a lot of consolidation, they have a lot of, fibrin and things like that, right? Zinc should be able to help those animals basically chew up that fibrin and rebuild healthy cells. And things like copper and things like that will help with that rebuilding process with things like lysyl oxidase. So I think minerals are really uniquely, especially zinc and copper, really uniquely suited to help our animal recover from these kind of pneumonia type challenges because we can help prevent some of that lung consolidation. Now, some of that's conjecture on my point, but seeing some of these other studies and some other data, I really think there's something intriguing to think about there. Okay, so just a reminder, cattle in this study had adequate trace mineral status and had a relatively mild infection. And then prior to infection, basically giving Multimin at the time of like we would do for arrival or processing, the day after arrival, that gave us our best improvement. So I think giving it before, like an ounce of prevention is better than a cure kind of saying, I think that's still better. Giving it concurrent 2 days after infection with our Draxxin treatment did give benefits, but it wasn't maybe as strong as giving that protection beforehand. Also, really back to that where I started this story and the vets questioning if it was a good thing to give it to sick animals, we saw no negative effects of giving injectable trace mineral prior to or during the disease challenge. And if anything, all the signs would actually point towards very positive effects. I think improving trace mineral status is especially important in preparation for fighting disease based on our improvement in IL-6 production data from the in vitro analysis, and then the increase in the natural killer and gamma delta T cells coming to the lungs. I know that from my time in South Africa, you guys have a lot of severe deficiencies of things like zinc because of high calcium soils or other things. And so I think just again, reminding that we saw these positive effects and we didn't have a crazy robust disease response because of that being the beef animals, and they weren't deficient, and we still see positive effects. So I think that's just super intriguing to think of the potential benefits we would see with, relatively deficient conditions. Okay, so I'm going to tell one more story after this, but I'm going to pause here just for a second if you want to grab this. So this QR code, if you take your phone and you point it at the screen to that QR code, don't take a picture of it, but just look at it. When the little yellow website pops up underneath it, click that, and that'll take you to this paper. Otherwise, you can just Google it later, or maybe the moderators can send it out. This is an open access paper. There's no limits. You should be able to get to it and be able to download a PDF and be able to review all the data in there for yourself. So I'll keep moving to get onto my last piece of my story here, but again, the moderators can send you this information too. Okay, so the last piece I want to talk about, again, because I just said I've been to South Africa before, I know the challenges that you have with antagonists. This is one of the questions that I get a lot related to this particular product, which is, does it work in the face of antagonists? Is it good to use it before or concurrent with antagonists? And so we designed this study. This was a part of Sarah Hartman's master's work here a few years ago, where we really wanted to ask that exact question. So we used some red Angus steers in this study, and we wanted to say, how quickly and how robustly could we improve trace mineral status after we had caused a decrease in status from antagonists? So I'll show you this on the diet so it'll be easier to understand. So I took these growing calves, so again, they were about 250 kilos or so at the start of the study, and I split them equally into one of two 90-day diets. So these are depletion phase diets. My controls are going to get all of the NRC recommendations for trace minerals and no added antagonist. My antagonist treatment is going to get only cobalt and iodine supplemented, so no manganese, no copper, no zinc, no selenium. We're going to add just a little bit of molybdenum and a little bit of sulfur. So these are potent antagonists, especially to things like copper. So fed these diets for 90 days, corn silage-based diet, growing diet. And then after that 90 days, we take biopsies and blood, and I'll show you those data in just a second. And now we said, if you're a producer and you realize, oh, I have a problem, I have animals who are deficient for whatever reason, how could you fix it? And if you were trying to fix it, you probably didn't have the luxury of just taking the antagonist out of the diet, right? You can't just suddenly say, well, I don't have any sulfur from my water or any molybdenum from my forage. So we designed to say, we're going to keep the control diet and we're going to keep the antagonist diet. And now we're going to do these 3 different repletion strategies. I'm going to show you this on the next slide, but this will be a 62-day repletion period. Actually, this should be 42-day repletion period from what I'm going to show you today. And we're going to give Multimin, we're going to use inorganics, or we're going to use a blend. So let me explain that. Whoops, let's take that up. Okay, so we're going to have 3 repletion treatments. One is going to be, we're going to feed NRC at 100%. So 10 parts per million of copper, 20 of manganese, 30 of zinc, 0.1 of selenium, and they get a Multimin injection on day 0. Okay, so that's our ITM treatment. The inorganic treatment is we're going to feed 150% of NRC. So we're going to feed 15 of copper, 30 of manganese, for example, right? So a 50% bump above NRC. So because we're like, we got a problem, we got to try to fix it. So we're going to feed 150%. This is all going to be from sulfates. So copper sulfate, manganese sulfate, zinc sulfate, sodium selenite. And then our blend treatment is because it's very common in our industries to feed some proportion of organic trace minerals. That's what this treatment is. So our blend is going to be 25% from an organic, so either Avela copper, Avela zinc, Avela manganese, or Cellplex selenium. And then the other 75% was from inorganic. Okay, so Multimin plus 100% NRC in the diet, 150% NRC in the diet, all from inorganics, 150% NRC in the diet, 25% organic, 75% inorganic. So 6 treatments now at this point. Okay, so what happens when you feed antagonists for 90 days? So this is the end of the depletion period. Well, it's no bueno, it's no good for your copper. So we routinely, when we feed these depletion diets, decrease liver copper about 80 to 90%. And that's exactly what we did here. So our antagonist treatment is quite deficient at this point in copper, very adequate in the control treatment. We actually, even though both manganese and zinc are not very good biomarkers, we statistically decrease manganese here, and then we decrease liver selenium as well. So all of those things kind of to be expected. Plasma also changes. So we actually decrease all of our markers here in the plasma. And again, even though that liver is completely drained in the antagonist treatment, you can see that it's only a little bit reduced from our controls. Trying to pay attention to my time here, but I'll just tell a real quick story. This is such a great example of why something like plasma copper is not a great biomarker for copper status, right? So I use the analogy of thinking about the fuel line on my vehicle versus my gas tank. I am notorious for letting my gas tank get very, very low, has the E that it's flashing at me for way too long, because I know exactly how long I can drive it before I have to pull into the gas station. And it's really cold out right now, right? So I can do that because I still have fuel in the fuel line that's going to get me up to the gas station. So the liver is like the gas tank in this analogy, and its job is to keep the fuel line or the plasma at homeostatic controls. So plasma copper, most of these, is not going to drop until the liver has gotten very, very low. So if we were to take a biopsy on these cattle, we would say, well, that liver copper is very low. But if we took a plasma sample, we might be like, well, it's kind of borderline. We might or may not have a problem. But that liver data would say we definitely have a problem. Okay. Oh, there's my slide. So repletion period. So these are the treatments we just talked about. Okay, I just put this here. As you can see, the steer is actually later at the end of their study to remind myself there were no interactions between the control and antagonist diet and which trace mineral repletion strategy we used. And that frankly shocked the heck out of me, because I expected that we would see that the antagonist diet would give us very different results than the diet that didn't. But really what we see is the same kind of type of trends. The magnitude is just different. So I'm just going to show you actually the data pulled together. So this is looking at liver copper concentrations during our 6-week repletion period. So you can see our guys who came off of who are on the antagonist treatment, they're very low, right? This is 23 parts per million of liver copper. This is about 250 up here in our controls. Now remember, everybody here, so this is all through repletion, this is my treatments merged. So this is going to be eventually cattle who got Multimin, cattle who got 150% from blend, 150% from inorganic. And so you can see that they do have a little bit of an increase, but they kind of just hold steady. Whereas the guys who are still on the antagonist diet, now that we've improved their trace mineral supplementation strategy or given them Multimin, we're going to just tick, 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 steadily increase. So we go from about 23 to about 70 here by the end in this 6-week period. So cattle are very good at replenishing liver copper once we provide it. Okay, I'm just going to show you this last kind of piece of data here. Again, this paper is published as well if you want to see all of this, the results, because this is one of the things in research that we joked that the cattle actually read the research protocol because they did what we would have hypothesized. So this is liver copper concentration. This is going to be the end of depletion or the start of repletion. And then 2 weeks into that, 4 weeks into that, and 6 weeks into that. The yellow is going to be our all inorganic treatment. The black is going to be our injectable trace mineral treatment or Multimin treatment. And the red is going to be our blended organic inorganic treatment. So we start out here at day 0, and they're all pretty similar to each other, not different. And our black line is our Multimin, and the next time we take a biopsy is day 14. And so you can see we've popped up about that 50 part per million increase. It's about 55 in this study. So remember, if I would have taken a biopsy here, like on day 1 post Multimin injection, I would have already had a value up here, right? We've seen that in multiple studies. this increase happens right away if we go in through the needle, right? Great power and great responsibility comes with the needle. You need to make sure you can read doses appropriately and follow that, but you can improve liver copper, very quickly. Okay, so we then maintain that out through day 28 and day 42. These are all kind of similar to each other in the black line, which is the Multimin treatment. Then here in the red, you can see by day 14, both of our treatments that we're feeding more dietary mineral to, right? This is 150% of NRC. They're still markedly lower than our Multimin treatment, but they're kind of numerically starting to tick up a little bit. But by day 28, we can see that our blended treatment has caught up with the Multimin treatment. So if I fed a blend of organic and inorganic, it took about 4 weeks in this case. Again, I don't know when that happened, right? Because I don't have a biopsy between these 2 days. But by 4 weeks, they're up similar with the Multimin. And then interestingly, in the all inorganic treatment, by my day 42 sample, they're still basically caught up with the others. So the point here is that depending on your time, depending on your abilities for things, any of these 3 strategies worked. It was just about how quickly you could get there and start getting that replenishment versus the time that it might take. Okay, so just a few recaps from this study, and then we'll wrap up. Dietary antagonists, I think this is a great example of how bad they are for trace mineral status in cattle, especially things like copper. Interestingly, the presence of antagonists that stayed in that diet during the repletion for that treatment did not interact with the 3 different strategies that we used for repletion. However, the magnitude of liver mineral is greater in those who are on the control versus the deficient or the antagonist, because they are not going to necessarily store it. They're sending it out to do all the things like supporting growth and supporting immune function that they hadn't been able to do because they were limited before we started repletion. Most quick response was from the injectable trace mineral. Supplementing the 150% from the blend was next, and then supplementing the 150% of NRC from all inorganic took the longest. Okay, so overall, across many of the studies that I've done and other scientists have done with Multimin, we consistently see steady increases in liver copper and selenium, and see increases in enzymes in blood requiring trace minerals like selenium and manganese. Zinc continues to be one of the things where we're likely seeing some benefits. I think some of the immune cell stuff we probably saw in this study was due to zinc, but again, no good biomarkers for zinc, so that's always a struggle for us as a researcher. We know trace minerals from our work and others are absolutely critical to support immune responses in cattle. And in this case, we were able to say to feedlotters, you can give Multimin at time of arrival, or you can give it concurrent with antibiotic treatment. And they were both better than the controls, although I think if you can give it beforehand at arrival, that is better. Okay, and so this is my final slide, and I'll just say if you're interested in following me on LinkedIn, I try to give updates on our research, so that's this QR code right here. This is my email address. I think the organizers are going to maybe send my slides out to you later if you're interested as well, so you can get some of that information. And then when I'm not at work, I also write crime fictions. So this is my website for that, and this is my book that came out earlier this spring. So with that, I'm going to take this off just so I can see faces and stuff and hopefully answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that was a really excellent talk. We don't have any specific questions from the audience yet, but I think just to sum it up from my side, it's always nice to see that we keep on digging a little bit deeper when it comes to Multimin and the mode of action and what advantages it has for producers. And I think we have a lot of challenges in South Africa, as you mentioned, like, for example, not even sulfur, but high iron levels in grazing and water sources acting as antagonists. And I've seen studies, a very old study, you might know it, or et al. 1990, showing with the IBR infection, for example, how much copper and zinc is drawn out of the body or excreted through the urine and lost when there's a disease challenge.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, we just finished a really intensive metabolism study this last summer at Iowa State, where we had cattle in metabolism crates while we gave them disease, in part to try to answer some of that question, because we just don't know where the minerals are going. Are they being excreted in the urine, or are they mobilizing them to some other part of the body? And that's been really interesting to see actually how lung mineral concentrations are changing as some of those things get pulled to the lung and some others get kicked out.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting to see. And I think our strategy in South Africa is also, the basis is good oral trace mineral supplementation. And organic trace minerals, unfortunately, I love it, but it's an expensive part of the diet. And I think here in South Africa, we also sort of use a blend, 25% organic, 75% inorganic. And I think all three of those are quite important. Your research just showed the crux of Multimin, to give it at critical times when you need that immediate increase in trace minerals, but you still need a good base, good oral trace mineral nutrition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why I was so excited with just being able to do the health study that I just shared, because it's a question, it's so practical. We get the question all the time, when's the best time to potentially use this? And this clearly said there were not negative effects from doing it. And we see some of these benefits, and those were to animals who had very good status. So I just think that says, getting it into the bloodstream is perhaps helping it get faster to certain places of the body where it needs to be before it has that kind of challenge.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before and to the audience. We saw that we unfortunately had some foot and mouth disease outbreaks in our dairy herds in South Africa recently. And we saw some very, very good responses when they tried Multimin out of desperation to increase the immune status of those animals. But that would also be an interesting study in the future. But yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We don't want that one here.
No, yeah. Yeah, it was a good field trial, but hopefully that we won't face that problem ever again in South Africa. Any questions from the audience? I think your talk was so good. It was like very well explained, and we will obviously share the slides and everything with everybody. And thanks for sharing your details. People are more than welcome to contact Stephanie. Yeah.
Adele, there's one question in the questions tab.
Okay, the question is, we see a lot of almost toxic serum copper levels in feeders at arrival in feedlots and almost total depletion in copper liver levels. Do you also see this? So I think, it's talking about serum copper levels again versus liver copper levels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so one of the reasons that we don't like serum copper or plasma copper as a biomarker is because things like ceruloplasmin, the acute phase protein, which we commonly see increased on arrival or shortly after arrival because of stress, because of viral challenges, things like that, it will falsely inflate that plasma copper and look different from like the liver copper. So if you have the liver copper value, that's super useful because you're able to see, the actual status for that animal. I literally just yesterday, I was looking the metabolism study I just described. I was sitting down with a student and she's like, I have some of these plasma coppers that are like 0.8. Do we believe these? And we're looking at the rest of their data and we're like, yeah, we believe it. They were some of the sickest animals at that time point. So I think that really fits with it. I think it unfortunately just reinforces that plasma copper or serum copper is unfortunately not as useful as we'd like it to be.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then Eric made a comment, the glucuronide conjugation does not have an impact on these as well.
I'm not sure what that question is asking.
Glucuronide conjugation. I'm also a little bit unsure.
I think it might just be a comment on the copper levels. I'm not sure. Eric, would you mind just explaining your question or comment for us?
Yeah, while he's maybe elaborating on his question or comment,
Yep.
Unfortunately, in South Africa, I know a lot of vets do liver biopsies, which is a good indication to track trace mineral status of a herd, doing it on a regular basis and so. But one of the main things that I would have loved to measure in South Africa is actually the enzyme activity. Glutathione peroxidase and superoxide dismutase activity. Yeah, unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have a lab in South Africa that can measure that. So, yeah. But luckily, a lot of people or good researchers like yourself are doing work across the world with Multimin to show that enzyme activity.
Yeah, and honestly, there's probably enzymes we haven't really even thought about. Like, actually, one of the coolest parts about being a mineral nerd for beef cattle is that there's so much continuity across species. So if the human researchers discover a new enzyme or a role for something, like kind of another branch of my research, we're doing a lot of things with obesity and markers of diabetes and stuff, actually, because we have such fat cattle by the end of the finishing period that they're actually working as a model for some of these things. And we can pull some of that information from the human literature. So are there even other manganese dependent enzymes or copper dependent enzymes that might be really important that we haven't really looked at yet?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, those are the two main ones that I know of, but there's probably many more that has to do with the immune system. And yeah, it's very interesting.
Yep.
Okay. We'll have a discussion with Eric maybe afterwards. If there's no other questions, Corneille, you don't see anything else?
No, I haven't seen anything in the chat room. The slides have been shared for those of you. I don't know this question. There's a question from Chantal.
How often would you recommend giving Multimin to a sick animal to maintain adequate levels, and is there a possibility of overdosing?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that because of the improvements that we see in things like liver copper and liver selenium, we don't recommend a gap of shorter than 90 days or so for giving that. And I assume that your guidance is probably similar there in South Africa to what we have here in the States. I also anecdotally hear about people doing half doses of different things, but we haven't tested that. And I think it's better just to follow those label guidelines. So again, I think our research shows you can give it before and see benefits. You can give it, concurrent. So that gives you some flexibility. Do you just treat the sick animals that get off the truck on arrival and then you don't have to give it to everybody, or you keep it in your ancillary therapy, bag? There's a lot of flexibility with it, but I think we want to be careful not to overdo it, because that is one of the powers of going in through the needle, is that we can overwhelm that.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Stick to the recommended dose, and what I think what your studies show is doing it as a pre-injection, let's say at induction, feedlot induction is better than treating sick animals, but your data has also showed that it can be given concurrently with the disease. But yeah, we have certain guidelines.
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. I think Chantal's just typing something. I don't see any other questions. Eric is not giving us more information, but we could just be in contact with him to clarify that afterwards. So I think that ends our webinar for tonight. So thank you, Adele, once again for Virbac. Love doing your webinars for you, and looking forward to a couple more in 2025. Prof Stephanie, thank you for joining us. Please keep warm, please keep safe. And to every person attending the webinar, thank you for joining us tonight. We do appreciate having some family time out, but we're still in time for dinner, I think. And then from my team as well, thank you. Merry Christmas. Have a blessed holiday season. Please look after yourself, and please come back safe in 2025. I'm not sure if you want to say a closing word, Adele.
Yes, thank you very much to everyone and your time. I really appreciate it, and have a blessed and safe festive season.
Thank you, everybody.